Hi everybody, Mr. Chris here. So it's time for economics class. So I'm outside the building here, and I'm here by this faucet. If I can get it into view, there we go. And I wanted to show you something. So if you pretend that I'm the Fed, which stands for the Federal Reserve, and you pretend that this thing here is the money supply, then I'm going to demonstrate to you kind of what the Fed really pretty much does. And so this is essentially what the Fed does. If you imagine that this is the money supply, the Fed essentially gets to determine how much money is circulating in the market right now. So when they feel like we need more money in circulation, they'll just use different tools to open up the money supply like that. And when they think that there's too much money in circulation, they'll go ahead and they'll kind of close things down. And they essentially have three different tools to be able to do that. So, right? Do we need more money? All right, let's go ahead and open it up. We need less money? Okay, let's go ahead and close things down. So our lesson today is going to be about how exactly the Fed does that. So while I walk back into my office, I'm going to be giving you the rest of my introduction here. So let's see here. So today's objectives are going to be as follows. First off, you should be able to do these three things by the end of class today. You should be able to explain the difference between the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, and you should be able to explain the difference, or should be able to explain how the Federal Reserve is organized. Sorry, I'm messing with my keys here. And you should be able to explain the three different ways that the Federal Reserve controls the amount of money in circulation. And those three things are open market operations, which means buying and selling government securities. The second one is reserve ratios. And the third is discount rates. So those are the three different tools that the Fed uses to control the amount of money that is in circulation. Okay, so before we get started, let's do a little bit of review. So you should stop the video and go to Quizlet, and you should review the terms for chapters 8 and 9, and then come back. All right, so now that you are back, let's do a little bit of review here. And so the camera is going to go sideways for a bit here, or for the rest of the class, just like that. So sorry if that really messes things up for you. Okay, so so let's review 9.1, the three functions of money. So the three functions of money are to be a medium of exchange, to be a measure of value, and to provide a store of value. The six characteristics of money are portability, durability, homogeneity, divisibility, constancy, and intrinsic valuableness. In 9.2, we talked about metallic money. We learned that specie is coined metal money. We learned that debasing means mixing base metals with precious metals when you're making coins. Gresham's law states that bad money drives out good money. Face value means the value that is stamped on the face of metal money. Inflation, which is the increase of prices or the decrease of the amount of stuff that each dollar can buy, takes place when the amount of money in circulation outpaces the amount of stuff there is to buy with that money. And then we also learned that deflation, which is the decrease of prices or the increase in power of each dollar, takes place when the amount of stuff there is to buy outpaces the amount of money in circulation. In 9.3, we learned that legal tender is any form of money that has been declared a valid means of payment. We learned that paper money was first created when goldsmith banks began issuing paper receipts to depositors who began to use the receipts to buy and sell things rather than the gold itself. And we learned that fractional reserve banking started when goldsmith banks kept only a fraction of the gold deposits on hand and provided loans with the rest of the deposits. We also learned, finally, that the U.S. government's money and most modern currencies use fiat money, which is legal tender, that is backed by nothing but a government's promise that the dollar or the amount of money or whatever will work. Okay, and in 9.4, we learned that M1 equals bills and coins, traveler's checks, and checking accounts. M2 means M1 plus savings accounts, CDs, and other term investments under $100,000. And M3 stands for M1, M2, and then CDs and term investments over $100,000 and other big money. Now, one little connection to make there, and when I was talking to my wife about this concept, I kind of remembered that maybe I didn't quite explain very well in the video that talked about M1, M2, and M3, about why exactly M1, M2, and M3 are used. And so let me just do a little aside here and do that now. So the reason that M1, M2, and M3 are used is because we have a fairly complex and complicated money supply system today. And so the question you may ask is, well, how much money do we actually have? How much money is there actually out there? And the only way to really answer that question is to categorize the money and say, okay, well, if you're asking how much money there is, well, which kind of money are you talking about? Are you talking about the actual dollars and the actual coins? Are you talking about the amount that's also in checking accounts that can be turned into coins or bills if need be? Or are you talking about the investments that don't exist except on paper? What are you talking about exactly? So M1, M2, and M3 are used as designations to help economists think about or make sense of which kind of money that they're actually dealing with. Okay. Finally, in 9.4, we learned that credit cards can be a good idea, but need to be used with great amounts of caution. But more importantly, that credit cards are not actually a form of money. It might be kind of confusing because the term for legal tender is anything that can be used as a form of payment. And you might think, well, credit cards are a form of payment. But not actually, because credit cards are actually just a way of facilitating short-term loans that must be then repaid with legal tender. All right, let's move on to our new content for today. So today, we're learning about the Treasury, the Federal Reserve System, and commercial banks. All right, so money supply is managed by, first, the Department of the Treasury, and secondly, by the Federal Reserve, who controls how much money is in circulation. So the Treasury prints and mints, and the Federal Reserve controls how much money is actually in circulation. So to help make sense of this, I've got a couple of different charts I want to show to you, or draw for you up on the whiteboard. So first off, let's take a look at the first concept, which is that the Treasury makes bills and coins. So this first building represents the Treasury, and the second building represents the Fed. And the Fed, again, is short. Fed is short for Federal Reserve, and I'll explain a lot more about the Fed here in just a bit. But so the Treasury makes bills and coins and gives them to the Fed, and the Fed then controls how much of this money is going to be going into circulation. So I'm going to draw a little faucet coming off of this thing here. So we're going to do that like this, and then that's our faucet, and then we have a little spinner wheel on top that's going to control how much money is actually entering the market. Okay, so the Fed then has basically two different sort of directions that it can go to control the amount of money in circulation. And the first one is to control how many bills and coins are in circulation, right? So it's the money that's coming, or the bills and coins that are coming from the Treasury to the Fed. The Fed can then control how many bills and coins are actually going into circulation. And so that in your textbook is called open market operations. Open market operations. Okay, so this part of it is dealing with actually how much currency is in circulation. The second way that the Fed can control how much money is in circulation is by taking care or managing loans. And so this concept is very much based off of the reserve banking. What's the term I'm looking for? The fractional reserve banking. Thanks. Thanks. Off the fractional reserve banking system. And so that idea, again, is that that banks are really only holding on to a fraction of the deposits that have been made in the bank, and that the rest of it is loaned out. And so a good rule of thumb to use is that however much money is actually in banks, checking accounts, and saving accounts, if you take that amount of money and you multiply it times 16, that's about how much money is actually in circulation. 1/16 of it is actual money that's in banks. And the other 15 parts, the 15/16 is money that's been loaned out. And that's the effect of fractional reserve banking. So there's way more money that's actually circulating out there, while the real amount of money is that's actually sitting in the banks is like 1/16 of it. Make sense? So a bank takes the amount of money that you've deposited into the banks, it keeps just a bit of it, and it lends the rest out. And the multiplying effect of that is that for every dollar in a bank, there's about $15 that have been loaned out to people. And that has the effect of increasing the amount of money that's actually in circulation. The real money is actually back in the banks, but the money that exists on paper that's been created by making loans is far greater. And so the Fed has two ways of controlling how much money is actually out there: by controlling the actual currency, the bills and coins, and also by controlling loans. Okay, so this here, there are two ways for it to control loans, and that is through establishing and managing reserve ratios, which is the amount of money that the commercial banks actually have to keep on hand, and they can then lend the rest out. And the third thing we'll talk about then, third tool, is discount rates, which is the interest rate that the Fed charges to commercial banks for borrowing money. Okay. There you go. Treasury makes the money, gives it to the Fed. The Fed then disperses bills and coins through open market operations, which we'll look at in just a bit. The Fed can also control loans by setting reserve ratios for commercial banks, and also by setting discount rates. All right, so let's move on to our next chart. So we're going to then be talking about these three in turn. So first up is open market operations. Open market operations. Okay, so in this particular chart, actually, sorry, before we get to the next chart, let's look at how the Fed is organized. So here's how it is organized. And once again, when I say Fed, I'm referring to the Federal Reserve System, which is a system of banks that control the amount of American dollars that are in circulation. Okay, so first off, here's how it's organized. It is headquartered in New York City, which is kind of the world's banking capital. It has 12 branch banks that are spread across 12 U.S. zones. And you can see a map of this on page 155 in your textbook. So where's the branch bank for our particular zone? We're zone number 12, which makes sense. We're the furthest one to the west, so we're the last zone. Zone number 12 is headquartered out of San Francisco. And as you can see, we're part of a really huge zone. And that makes sense because there's not that many of us out here, relative to the number of people that are living on the East Coast, especially in the Northeast. They get 3 zones, from Maine down to like Maryland. Okay, so there are 12 branch banks spread across the 12 different U.S. zones. See the map on page 155. And then lastly, there are 7 board members that are appointed by the president and then given the thumbs up by the Senate, affirmed by the Senate. And then those 7 board members get to make major decisions for the Fed and all the branch banks. Okay, how does the Fed control the money supply? So first off, buying and selling government securities, which our textbook refers to as open market operations. Open market operations. Okay, so we have 3 different entities that we need to think about in this case. So at the top, we're going to be looking at the Fed. Okay, we're also going to be considering, actually, let me get rid of that for right now. We're also going to be considering people. like you and me, and we also will be considering the government. In this case, it's the federal government. Okay, so the way that the federal government borrows money is by selling securities. And securities are often split up into different kinds of things, but they all are the same thing. But when you say a government security, what you mean is a way for the government to borrow money. So typically, like there's something called treasury notes, which are short-term loans to the government, and then there's bills and there's bonds, and they're all different ways of giving money to the government short-term, making loans to the government. And so government securities means the federal government is borrowing money. So in this case, when the federal government needs money, it can sell securities to people. It sells securities to people, and it's always a bit of a confusing way of talking about borrowing money, because it sounds like they're selling something off, which means that they're getting money for good, but actually selling securities simply means borrowing money. So it's selling securities, and in exchange, people give them money. And then eventually, obviously, the government will have to pay that money back. But for now, we're just focusing on the fact that the government is selling securities to the people, and the people are giving the government money. So it's a big way that the government funds itself. Okay, now, the way that the Fed can get money into circulation is like this. So imagine again that the Treasury Department has delivered a bunch of money to the Fed. And the Fed has this money has this money sitting in warehouses. I don't actually know how this works exactly, but this makes sense. And this is all you need to understand is that the Treasury Department makes the money, gives it to the Fed disperses it, and so that's as much as you really need to know about that. So now we're going to look at how the Fed actually does that. So how does the Fed actually get money into circulation? Okay, so what it does is the Fed buys securities. So the Fed buys securities from the government. So it's just like the people, right? So securities, which are short-term loans, the Fed is giving money, is getting securities from the government. And just like the people give the government money, the Fed also gives the government money. Well, now where does that money come from? Well, that money actually comes from the Treasury Department, who has just made the money, right? And so that's how the government gets money into circulation. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute. Doesn't the Treasury Department just make the money? And then you're saying that the Fed gives the money to the government. So why doesn't the government just print a bunch of money? And those are, if you're thinking that, those are really great questions, and we're not going to get into it at this point. So just stick with me here. This is how the Fed gets money into circulation. It buys securities from the government, and it gives the government money. The government then uses that money to make purchases and stuff, and that's how that new money gets out into circulation. Now, suppose that the government or the Fed decides that, oh, too much money in circulation, we want to take some out of circulation. So what does it do? So in that case, what it does is it decides to sell off the securities that it holds, right? So it has a bunch of these securities on file, and it decides it wants to sell those off to maybe the people. Sell those off to the people. And so what happens is the people give their money to the Fed. And when that money goes to the Fed, it disappears. You see, the Fed makes money up here, and it makes it disappear. And so that's how it controls the money supply. When money comes out of the Fed, it appears. When money comes into the Fed, it disappears. And so that is how the Fed can actually can open up the spigot. It's opening up the spigot on this side, and it's closing the spigot on this side. Money into the market, money out of the market. Okay, so that's called open market operations. It's how the Fed gets money into and out of circulation. And when I'm talking about money into and out of circulation, I'm talking about bills and coins specifically. Bills and coins into circulation and out of circulation. All right, so now let's take a look at the next tool that the Fed uses, Remember, the next tool does not deal with bills and coins. The next bill deals more specifically with loans. Okay, this next tool is deals with reserve ratios. So, in fractional reserve banking, banks hold on to a particular amount, a particular percent of the deposits that have been made into the bank. And typically, that amount that is held onto is between 10 and 15% of the deposits that have been made. And then they'll lend out the other 85 to 90% to people, and they make their money that way. They'll charge interest for doing that, and then pass on some of that interest to you, which is why you can make money by opening a checking account. Excuse me, got a hoarse throat all of a sudden. Okay, so the way this works is as follows. I'm just going to draw two different commercial banks here. And this is actually going to be the same bank under different circumstances. So let's say that the Fed says that that banks are being required to maintain very little in terms of deposits. So what ends up happening then is, since the bank has more money to lend out, it is going to make more loans to more people because it has more money that it can lend out. And the Fed will use this particular circumstance when it feels like more money needs to go into circulation. It's going to tell banks, you can go ahead and lower the amount of money you need to keep on hand so that there's more money to lend out. And so that means that there's going to be more money flowing out in the form of loans. Now, if the Fed decides that there's actually too much money in circulation, then what it'll do is it'll say, okay, banks, you actually have to keep a higher amount of money in reserve. And so that leads to fewer loans being taken out, which has a way of slowing down the amount of money that's in circulation. Okay, so first circumstance, so this is the reserve ratios tool. Lower reserves means more money into circulation in the form of more loans, and higher reserves in the bank mean less money flowing into circulation in the form of loans. All right, that takes us to our final tool that the Fed has, and that is the discount rates. Discount rates. Whiteboard hasn't quite finished drying yet. Got a little streaky there. Okay, discount rates. So the discount rate is the rate at which the Fed lends money to commercial banks. So why would the Fed lend money to a commercial bank? Here's an example. So imagine that you buy a house and that the house costs $300,000. So you put down 20%, which is $60,000, leaving you with a loan from Columbia Bank for $240,000. And a special loans for houses are a special kind of loan called a mortgage. And so you've got a $240,000 mortgage. Now, let's say that you go through the entire process, which usually takes anywhere between 30 and maybe 60 days to get all the documents in place and to get all your ducks in a row, I's dotted, T's crossed. And so finally, there's going to be a closing date. And on that closing date, everybody who's connected to this, the banks, any sort of banks, lawyers, whoever, they're all going to either meet together in the same room, or they're all going to separately sign documents, but there's going to be a closing date that brings the whole thing to completion, and then on that date, money is actually going to change hands. Okay, so let's say you've got this $240,000 that's coming from Columbia, and Columbia is going to be paying that money up front to the seller of the house, and then they're going to be charging you interest over 15 to 30 years as you pay that mortgage back, and that's how they're going to be making their money. But let's say on the day of closing, on the day that Columbia actually needs to get the $240,000 check to the seller of the house, let's say they don't actually have that amount of money on hand for whatever reason. And so what they're going to do on that day is they'll go to the local Fed branch, which is down in San Francisco, and they're going to say, hey, could we borrow $240,000 from you? And then the Fed branch would say, yeah, sure, of course. And then they'll give that money to them, and Columbia will then use that to fund the amount that they have to give to the seller of the house. Okay, so that is how banks will borrow money from the Fed, or why commercial banks borrow money from the Fed. So commercial banks always know that they can rely on borrowing this money from the Fed if need be. And they also know the discount rate, which is the rate at which the Fed is going to lend money to them. And so commercial banks always know how much a loan is going to could ultimately cost them. And so they know that they always need to charge at least that amount, the amount of the discount rate, plus maybe another 1 to 2 to, I'm not a banker, so maybe 5% on top of that discount rate, so to ensure that they'll actually make money as well. So I'm going to throw out a number here. So typically mortgages, like over the last year, have been the amount of interest, or the interest rate that a commercial bank has been charging somebody for a mortgage over like the last year has been somewhere around 4%. And so that probably means that the Fed was lending money to commercial banks at a rate of like 2 to 3%. And so like that's the amount that I'm paying on my mortgage with Columbia right now is 3.75%. And so probably Columbia, if they would have needed to borrow money from the Fed to be able to make the transfer of money on the closing date for the house that I bought, they probably would have borrowed that money at somewhere around 2% or so of interest. So that is why commercial banks sometimes borrow money from the Fed, and that's how the discount rate then determines how much the commercial banks are going to be charging. Okay, so I just have a simple graph here to show to you. So this, we're going to show two different sequence of events. So in both of these cases, this is the Fed. And this would be, let's just say this is the Fed branch in San Francisco. This is a local bank. Let's say it's Columbia. Okay, this scenario represents a low discount rate, and this is going to represent a high discount rate. So when the Fed is charging a bank a low discount rate, that means that the bank is going to be offering lower interest loans to people, which means that people will be more likely to borrow money. And so, if I have a business idea and I need to borrow $10,000 to do that, if I have to pay maybe 10% interest to get that money per year, I might think, it's a little much. That means I have to make a pretty good profit on that right out of the gate to be able to actually fund that. But if I could actually borrow like maybe $10,000 at a rate of like 4 or 5% interest, I might think, yeah, okay, why not? I mean, if worst comes to worst, I could always probably just borrow that money and invest it in the stock market and probably get like a 7 to 8% return, and I could for sure pay off my interest, right? And so the higher, so in this case, with a low interest rate from the Fed, the banks will pass that low interest rate on to consumers, and consumers will be lining up to borrow that money. So more loans. So what happens then is that more money goes into circulation in the form of loans, which increases the amount of money in circulation. Now, if the Fed decides, whoa, we need to back things off here, too much money in circulation, what they'll do is they'll simply raise the discount rate. The banks will then also have to raise the discount rate, which means that fewer people are going to end up borrowing money because it just costs more to borrow the money. Okay? That's it. 3 different ways that the Fed can control how much money is in circulation. Number 1 is open market operations, which is buying and selling government securities, which simply is introducing or taking away bills and coins. Number two is the Fed can tell commercial banks how much money they have to keep in reserve. And if there's a higher amount, if there's a lower amount that banks have to keep in reserve, it means that they can lend more money out, which means that there'll be more money in circulation. But if the Fed says you guys have to increase the amount of money you've got in reserve, that means less money is going to be going out the door in the form of loans, which decreases the amount of money in circulation. And then lastly, we have discount rates, which is the rate of interest that the Fed is charging commercial banks. And so whatever the rate of interest is, commercial banks will tack on a little more on top of that and then pass that on to consumers. And so the lower the interest rate, the more money will be flowing to the consumers in the form of loans, which increases the amount of money in circulation. And the higher the interest rate that the commercial banks are going to be charging to people, and the less money that's going to be flowing out in the form of loans, and the less money there will be in circulation. All right, that is your lesson for today. So today your assignment is to read and do 9.6 and answer the questions. Actually, sorry, there's one term that just kind of caught my eye here. Yeah, it's recession. So, you have heard of the Great Depression, and you probably have also heard of a recession. And the way that your textbook identifies what a recession is a period that lasts usually about 6 months or more, a period of at least 6 months or more, in which the economy recedes or declines. And so the way that the Fed will usually respond to a situation like that is by lowering interest rates. Actually, let me do them in order here. The way that the Fed would respond to a recession is to try to get more money into the market to get people to spend more money. And so what it'll do is, number one, it will buy more government securities. That gets more bills and coins into circulation. Number two, it will lower reserve ratios for commercial banks, which means there'll be more money that is now available to be lent out by commercial banks. And third, it will lower the discount rate, which means that now banks will be charging less interest to their consumers as well, which means that more people will be liable to borrow money. So that's typically how people respond to a recession. Now, we are in a really interesting time right now because we actually, so the economy was doing pretty well right up until very recently, before this whole COVID-19 thing hit us. But interestingly, before this whole thing hit, the Fed's discount rate was already quite low. And now that we are in a very massive recession because of COVID-19, the Fed needs to once again lower interest rates, lower the discount rate to be able to get more money flowing into the market. But there's actually not very much room anymore. There's not much that the government can do. And so along with that, the Fed also has instructed the Treasury to print, like, I think the number, I'm getting these numbers from Justin Smoker, but I believe he said something between 2 and 4 trillion additional dollars that the Fed is planning to dump into circulation. And I'm assuming that's through buying government bonds or government securities. And so there's going to be like way more money in circulation, and the interest rate is going to be really low here. And I'm not sure, I haven't actually heard what they will be doing with the reserve ratios, but essentially the Fed is doing whatever it can to try to get this economy to get up and going again during these really tough economic times. And so it really is going to be interesting over the next couple of months to see how the economy is going to respond. Is the dollar going to really inflate in value because of all the more money that's now because of the increased money supply? Or is it going to actually deflate in value because no one's actually going to take the bait and take those take advantage of those low interest loans? It kind of depends on what happens over the next couple of months, and so we'll have to see what happens. Okay, 9.6. Read, answer the questions. Stay safe, stay sane, stay inside. Mr. Chris out.